right, we are back for another episode. I have I will say, some self-consciousness about starting with all right now because Paul told me I do that. So now every time I say it, I'm like, damn. Yeah, and I'm conscious of it. I wish I never was. But anyways, all right, here we are. We are back. And just a quick shout out to everyone to, as I said last week, like us, subscribe us, share these episodes. It helps us to continue to make them. We have a lot of fun with them. But obviously we want the good word to continue to get out there. And if you like this episode or you liked a different episode, share it with someone, comments below, all of that good stuff. So today, as we referenced last week, for those of you who listened last week, we're going to continue our conversation on constraint-led training because we didn't have the privilege of having Ashley on. We actually talked a little more about hitting. What a treat for everyone. Doesn't happen very often. We referenced some pitching stuff, but we didn't get fully into it. And so we thought this would be a good opportunity to not exactly follow up on sort of the details that we talked about last week from a constraint-led training aspect. But one of the big ways that we implement that style of training is through Plyos in our pitching programs. And Plyos probably could be many episodes, but we thought we would come back to talking specifically about pitching. So obviously there's Plyo programs for overhand throwing that you can check out. We don't directly sort of oversee any of those. We have teams and things that we've worked with in the past where we've incorporated some of that, but we don't really specifically have programming for that. So we're going to reference more on the pitching side of how we have incorporated Plyo balls. So first, maybe I'll kick it to Laura to talk about what are Plyos. What is the not the how we use them or the details or how they even help pitching or anything, but what is the overarching scientific concepts of a Plyo ball?
So Plyos they're sand filled, which is a very important aspect of the way they can give feedback because that sand is free to move inside the ball. Our Plyos specifically are seamless, which from a low intensity pitching standpoint, Ashley will talk a ton about of just having kind of a lack of intent necessarily about throwing a pitch type. So they're really great tools because the way that sand moves, it's basically a form of inertial exercise. If you are my age, you may know what the body blade is or a shake weight. It's the same concept that basically when the ball moves, there's a little bit of a lag and the sand catches up. And so when you're using them for overhand throwing, when you're using them for pitching, it's kind of that lag that, the arm is moving through space, that sand is moving, and it's letting the arm know through that, kind of catching up of the inertia, the momentum, hey, here's where my arm is in space. So they are, they're meant to basically be used particularly for throwing. They're so valuable for that because of the way the sand's free to move. And obviously, we'll go into, different weights and the way those are utilized. But the concept, again, it's just as simple as literally a shake weight or a body blade. Same concept. The sand does the exact same thing inside the ball.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I was trying to think back to when we started using Plyos. And if I think of our history in our doors for how we use them, it really did start with overhand throwing. At the time, we worked with teams pretty heavily. We were involved with an organization and we saw just kind of nightmarish overhand throwing mechanics and we wanted to attack them. And so we started researching ways to incorporate Plyos overhand because people were starting to use them really from driveline. I think a lot of that action started in driveline and pitchers. And then people were like, well, pitching's overhand throwing. And so we can use it for just position players. And then ultimately those concepts can come into softball from an overhand standpoint. And so we started building some very basic Plyo programs out of companies that were out there doing overhand throwing and really without knowing anything about what the heck we were doing or how we were doing it. We saw massive improvements in velocity, in reduction of pain that athletes were having overhand, and mechanics. Mechanics both just we could see with our eye, but obviously they were throwing at higher velocities and those types of things. And so I think that was our first thing of what the heck is going on here? We sort of did this mindlessly because it was something that we saw and it just seems to have worked without any really understanding. And so at that point we were kind of diving into pitching. And then I think we started doing a little bit more research. Obviously, Laura, that was right around when you came on as well to kind of help us understand the whys and making sure we were being thoughtful about how we were incorporating things. And so I think then in a much more thoughtful way, we were able to start incorporating them on the pitching side of like, how are these actually working? And what are the types of philosophies that we want to build into a pitching program? Why would we do them pitching? Does it even translate in the same way underhand? Like, what does that all look like? So Ashley, you can maybe take it from there of wherever you want to go, like the evolution of how we got to where we are, how we first started incorporating them, like what did Plyos look like at the beginning, or how did we first start getting to where we are now?
I think I won't start from the beginning. I think I'm bored by that. And as you know, if I'm bored by it, I've moved on. I moved on yesterday. I think I will not start with the beginning, because I think it's just like anything else with how we've evolved as OGX. It's just, we've just started collecting data. And we did it, all wrong to start, and we were willing to do it all wrong and just started navigating slowly. I think we thought it was about the drills. It was about, the reality is that it's not really the same approach as we take in overhand throwing. So much is ground-based and sort of like understanding the trunk contribution and creating stretch through the trunk and then letting the arm receive that energy. But the drills can target that movement and that concept so much more directly in overhand throwing, because it's a ground-based movement, meaning that the stretch is happening while you're still attached to the ground. And so in pitching, the rotational stretch of pitching happens while we're in the air. And so that's the summary of why we were getting things wrong. We were putting them in positions similar to what you do. There's staggered stance. There's things where, arms wrapped around your head. There's different versions of things to help promote this like rotational stretch concept. And you just can't mimic that in the underhand motion. So that's why we were getting it all wrong. That's all I want to say. Everything else bores me, basically. So where we are now is we've collected enough information about the underhand motion that what we see happens is that because it is so complicated, because the rotational stretch element happens while you're in the freaking air, you've got to create it in two different directions while airborne. The trunk breaks down a lot. And so because it's this kind of double whammy, because the trunk posture, rotation, etc., breaks down more so than we typically see in this sort of like, ground-based movement of an overhand throw. And because the underhand slot like limits how much surface area we cover with our hand position, it's this combination of those two elements where we were just seeing so clearly that we spend all of our time training the arm in pitching, like isolating the arm, making the wrist do more. And in reality, the reason why the hand doesn't do more is because it's getting blocked, meaning the breakdown further up the chain, if you will, or in the body region, in the middle of the body, is breaking down so significantly that the arm is just trying to do everything it can to get the job done, which is make the ball go that way, hit the task. And so the craft, if you will, the art form of what we're trying to accomplish just gets crushed. This means the transfer of of energy, which is obviously velo. This means the ability to manipulate hand position to create break, change speeds. It just starts to really regress the more that the arm is just trying to do it all. If it doesn't regress and the arm is doing more than what we really need it to be doing, this is where now pain starts to increase, right? So this is what we're learning. This is what we have learned by collecting all this data. It's like I use this phrase all the time. The arm is not the bad guy. It's trying to be the hero. And it just can't do all of that unless it's at the expense of X, Y, Z, et cetera, as I just mentioned. So here comes Plyos now. What Plyos are really about are, I would say, kind of three main concepts. But the first is to promote this trunk arm syncing, trunk arm efficiency, to get them to dance together, to get them to understand how to work with one another. You can think of this as the opposite as a static, staggered stance arm circle. I don't know why I'm cracking up, but the idea of putting someone's feet stuck and then just making them whip their arm around by itself as fast as possible. If this is offensive and I'm laughing, just take it as a cue. Stop doing that. It's exactly what happens in the motion. It's what blocks the craft of pitching. So we're trying to work against that. So don't create drills that promote the issue, promote the problem. So plyos, for the reasons that Laura just said, they are about understanding, getting the body to sync with the arm a little bit more, to stop just pulling with the arm, feeling all of that deceleration through the arm. It slows the arm down. It gives the body time to start moving. We do different drills that help the body contribute a little bit more. We identify what types of movements would be helpful for each individual pitcher in order to get the body to contribute more. There's a nature by the fact that they are squishy, meaning like they're not hard like a softball, in addition to the sand, as Laura mentioned. So a softball is large, it's hard, so we often squeeze it to be able to like hold it and control it in our hand. So that alone creates tension in the arm. And so the fact that you can grip it easily, it's squishy, it promotes a nice kind of fluid, relaxed arm action. So all of those variables really help. It's kind of like teaching the arm, like, stay in your lane. You will accomplish more when you stay in your lane. And so in order for the arm to stay in its lane, the body needs to do more, right? It needs to like hold up its end of the relationship. So that's a big part of what plyos are, and they really help do that. Another thing plyos are, just because they slow the arm down, and then we write programs that go from 50 to 75%. They're so
You want to stop
great.
really quick and explain why they slow the arm down? Because I think there's like an assumption being made there. Yeah,
I think there's this like lag concept that Laura's talking about, this like sand concept. One, we typically use overload.
Right.
So we usually are favoring overload, meaning heavier than normal. And then on top of that, because of the sand concept, this like shake weight, I don't know why that also, I pictured like a step aerobics or something when you said that. But that's it's kind of like that dual action. We already have that lag and the fact that sand is kind of weighing it down. And then we typically go with heavier than normal softballs. So we're usually 8 ounces, 12 ounces, that type of range. That's why.
Yep.
Okay. So this is like squirrel. What was I talking about?
Because it slows the arms down.
Jeez, Chris, I'm really not feeling
it wasn't funny because I did the exact same thing.
You know? Yeah, squirrel. Okay, so we usually write them to be like go from 50 to 75% intensity. Because what we're trying to do is like make sure, think about how we normally warm up in pitching. It's like an arm circle. Here it comes again, you know? It's like, so you're going to decelerate all of the energy all through the arm. We're like, no. Start with lower energy. Let's start to activate the body slowly. Keep the arm in check with how much it's being forced to decelerate. We know that by the time you get to 100%, the trunk breakdowns are going to be at their max and the arm is going to be decelerating. It's going to be in compromised position. We're trying to work and minimize that as much as possible. But that's what ultimately leads to arm pain, right? Is that we're just putting too much on the arm in a compromised spot. And so the 50% with plyos, it really forces our pitchers. It not only slows the intent down, it slows the body down, but now we're allowing the arm to essentially be in a better position because of that lag, because of that overload. It's all just like this slow activation, both with intensity and in position. We bump it up to 75. Now we start growing. We usually go 75% plyos, 75% softball, 100% intensity softball. And so it's such a healthy warm up is what I'm getting at. This idea of of just doing too much too fast happens all the time in pitching, and the arm takes the brunt of that. So it's great for building patterns, for syncing arm and trunk when it comes to an efficiency standpoint. They're phenomenal at building a nice, progressive, healthy warm up on a daily basis. And then I would say the number 3 category, and probably my favorite category, I don't know, we're in the world right now of like, what's your favorite thing about plyos? But that's the world I'm in because I love plyos, is arm adjustability. Basically this idea that because the trunk breaks down, because the arm does so much, it's stiff. And so because it gets stiff, essentially, it's trying to break. It's trying to brace all of that energy at the end of the motion. It's stiff. And when it's stiff, down goes velo, down goes break. Down goes command. And so what we are trying to promote is like, okay, if we can get the trunk to do more, if we can get the arm to stay in its own lane, we should be able to tap into higher levels of adjustability. So forget things like adjustability of creating upspin versus downspin, this speed versus this speed. That we'll get to on a softball. The base and foundational level of arm adjustability is taking away stiffness. I'm using my arm right now and no one on the screen can see it. But basically
look on
my
YouTube,
elbow
except
is
even on
straight.
YouTube, you couldn't see it because her arm's off the screen, but
yes, I don't know. I do that every time in a call. Anyway, my elbow is like locked out is what I'm trying to think. So it's really about, okay, when we get in this environment where the arm has more, it's unraveling. The upper arm is sending energy into the lower arm in this rotational stretch release concept. That's what I mean by unraveling. And it's not just this stiff elbow push. Now, this is the foundation of an art form. This is like, okay, you're going to throw different weights and hit different spots. And now you're going to be able to understand the timing at which that unraveling is happening. So you can't unravel, you can't have adjustability with stiffness. So we work to get the stiffness out, then we test it. Now that the arm is unraveling better, can you start manipulating the timing in which you unravel it? And that's command-based. I mean, that's why throwing plyos at different weights, hitting different spots, very task-based drills is like the number one pregame thing that I would do. Is like, you know, when athletes say, oh, in high school, yeah, the bus driver gets lost every single day because that apparently happens. It's like, because apparently sometimes high school bus drivers don't have GPS or something. I don't know. So it's like they get lost every single day. And then we get to the game, we have 5 minutes. I'm like, do these 3 things for dynamic warm up, do this many walk-ins with a plyo and get right to plyo variability, which means weight variability. Like if you are literally going to be sent in that game with 5 minutes to warm up, you've got to tap into that concept. And that's why I prioritize that so much. So it's like this idea of, can I manipulate the timing of that? And then the next tier off of that is, okay, it's not only about the timing of it, can I manipulate my hand position? And that is where, to me personally, a plyo is just not, we're no longer in plyo world. So that's got a different conversation. That's when we start using weighted softballs. That's when I want seams, because we're starting to think about hand position, pressure, what we're feeling at the finger level. But to me, that's not plyos. So plyos that have seams, I think people like them because they look cool. I don't really know the reason why people are like, they should have seams or what they would argue. And I would just argue, I think it's a social media, like it looks sexier concept. I do not like it. I'm not even who cares if it has seams? I do not want our athletes registering finger position, finger pressure, etc. at the plyo level. I simply want them to feel the concept of like anti-stiffness, the idea of having an arm that is loose, relaxed, can stretch and unravel, and manipulating the timing of it. That's where it ends. So, yeah, I would say they are, if someone was like, I don't have plyos, we can't do anything. It's the foundation of pitching. It's the foundational level of what we now know. Yes, you can do all the mechanics, work on the body, work on posture, all of these things. But what you've got to do is to really kind of like the brain to retrain the arm. At the end of the day, the ball is attached to the arm. We've got to train it to stretch and unravel appropriately and on time and vary that timing. And it is the absolute most efficient way to do that, the healthiest way to do that. So for that, I heart plyos.
Yep. I think we talked a little bit about like plyos specifically because they're like rubber, they're squishy, they have this sand in it. But maybe Laura, if you can walk us through, like, again, you know, we actually had the course on this. We can get more specifically into it generally, but like, this is kind of what I was asking about the lag, because there is the sand, but there is an element of we are manipulating weights, which I think people get really stuck to a lot. We obviously use overload and underload principles in hitting as well, which we talked about a little bit last week. But from the overload underload concept, Laura, can you give us just like a high level of why you would manipulate weights in training, kind of what the principles of an overload underload concept are?
The reason that, particularly in pitching, and I would say in overhand throwing too, I think this probably holds true. The way we're built, our arm is easier to move than our trunk. It's just going to move through space faster. So if we're trying to throw a ball, whatever, throw something, pitch, doesn't matter, our arm is just simply easier to move in space. It's lighter. It's got different aerodynamics to it than our trunk does. It just does. And so the reason overload for pitchers particularly is important is that the arm is generally ahead of the trunk. I would say 99% of the time. I'm not even sure we've ever seen a single pitcher where the arm somehow was not ahead of the trunk in some way, right? And so the goal with slowing the arm down and then also matching a intensity of the trunk is let's bring those in sync, because we've talked ad nauseum about this, but it's the timing of that. It's the ability for the trunk to be able to empty its energy into the arm, and it needs a maximum amount of time to do that. And so when we talk about late trunk arm timing, it means that basically the stride foot's already hit the ground, the trunk is already emptying its energy, and the arm ain't ready for it, right? And it's because it's so far ahead. So when we say late trunk arm timing, it's because the trunk is late, the arm is early. And that for me is that's something I always have to keep in mind. I still remember, I know you said you don't want to go back to the history of Plyos, but I still remember the day though, when, and it was probably Dee Dee. I'm going to guess that's who it was, who we were working with, you were working with, and you were messing around with some plyo variability and you kept videoing her to see how her trunk arm timing got synced up. I was like, done, I'm in. That makes so much sense to me of this timing concept. So overload is generally the approach we take simply because the motion kind of demands it, right? The arm's pretty easy to move in space and it's going to move faster. And so we slow the arm down. And when we slow the arm down, then we bring down joint forces, even though we bring down joint forces because we're slowing the acceleration down, right? When we slow that arm down, we add a little bit of mass to it. We're talking a couple of ounces at most here. So yes, we are adding mass, but because we're slowing the intensity of the motion in general down, we are slowing the arm down. And therefore those stresses, joint forces, et cetera, that the arm would experience are less. So from a safety standpoint, matching up plyo overload and lower intensity pitching, spot on. The thing we never do and is dangerous, and I would say if you are I'm going to reach to the camera and shake the screen. If you are working with a coach who's having you pitch high intensity with plyo overload, stop. It will hurt you. It will give you the yips. We've seen it too many times at this point. It's a dangerous application, right? We're trying to slow the arm down and then we're not letting the trunk sink up to it. And so now we're getting things all kind of out of whack, and it can lead to a whole host of things, the worst of them being injury. And so it's the matching of intensities and getting the timing. Underload is a different concept. We rarely use underload. We do that, and Ash, feel free to correct me here. I'm just going based on, what I've seen. We rarely use underload, and I think we've probably been a little bit more open to underload recently from a pitch design standpoint. Historically, we have only really approached underload, because remember, it's the opposite. We are now telling the arm, you are lighter than your arm plus a 7-ounce softball, right? So we put a 5-ounce plyo in their hand, or 2 ounces less. Now the arm can speed up, which we just said 99% of the time it's already ahead. So in the instances that we would apply underload, she's got a great trunk stability, right? And that's a lot of the reason why underload's really hard to apply, is because the number of pitchers that have excellent trunk stability that could withstand that, especially through, younger pitchers, high school pitchers, it's rare. And so that's a real risk reward. We have used that with college pitchers with good stability, to go after velocity, but it's a very, very specific application and requires that athlete to be solid in her trunk stability and ability to tap into rotation. But it's the reason that overload underload concept is so important. It's not just the sand that creates the variability, it's the changing of weights that creates variability. Ash, when you were talking about you were giggling about the K drill, we never put somebody in a staggered stance. I kept thinking it's like trying to deadlift your max and then get to the middle of your deadlift and say, okay, arms only, right? At 300 and some odd pounds, right? It makes no sense to take the body out of the equation. Our conversation last week about constraint-led training, the reason we don't break the motion down is because the entirety of the motion is the goal, right? So when we say plyo variability, the task doesn't change. It's still the full pitching motion. She's still throwing to a target. We don't change the external goal. Maybe it's an X on the wall. It's a particular part of a 9-hole zone, doesn't matter. The feedback that she's getting though becomes internal. So with hitting, we talked about last week, it was changing bats, changing ball type sometimes, changing the environment of the drill. for pitchers, this is really internal. It's why the plyos are so magical. I think we've used that like phrase before, like they're magic, because that feedback can become internal. And from, you know, our conversation last week, we know that's what leads to long-term movement pattern change. When I describe these concepts to the parents sometimes, or to clients potentially on sales calls, I'll say, like, strength and conditioning, we do this all the time. You change the load, change the weight, you change where it is, you regress in exercise, you progress in exercise. And we've told pitchers for their careers, you got to throw one way, my way sometimes. You got to throw one way, and you got to throw a 7-ounce ball the entire time. Maybe that ball gets bigger by an inch when you get to the right age, but that's it. There's no adaptation. There's no opportunity to explore any patterns. And so the application of plyos is internal feedback for that pitcher. Slow the arm down with
Laura,
overload.
you forgot one major piece to that. But then during the game, we will scream at you to make an adjustment.
That's correct. Use your legs, throw strikes.
We'll scream at you to make an adjustment despite all of the pitching, like the general, 100%. Like culture in training for pitching. It has nothing to do with adjustability.
Right.
Yeah.
And anyway, I think I'd add that.
I was going to say, your point about the arm stiffness, I think so much relates to, like, we are slowing the arm down. That's why that stiffness can go away, because then the arm doesn't have this responsibility, even just, you know, sort of through its own patterns with a normal ball. It's not experiencing the same stress and the same force. We use them in our return to pitching protocols, post-injury, post-time off, because of that concept. And that sometimes it can be I don't want to say a hard sell, but it can be difficult sometimes to convince athletes and sometimes their medical providers that this is what they should be following. You know, it kind of becomes a tricky conversation because there is a lot of rhetoric around weighted balls, overload, things like that with injury. And I think those things are very valid to consider.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's, as with anything, it's in the application of it, which I think is like, we have a lot of conversations. I think from the overload, underload, we obviously use this principle across all of our training because this variability concept is so important in so many ways. And hitting, obviously, adjustability is required, and switching bats for a variety of reasons, whether it's because you are training bat speed. And so syncing up your body, learning how to swing a heavier bat. And I want to come back to what we mean by heavier, because I think that's important, but a heavier bat or a heavier ball. But in the case of hitting, it does train you to swing the bat faster, and underload can also train you to swing the bat. So you can be going for this speed concept sometimes. But it also, at the end of the day, it causes you to have variation in your body that you then have to adjust to, which is part of this training process, right? Is getting to the other side of it. We're asking you to make an adjustment, and we're guiding you and feeling that and making adjustments by creating variability on you in a variety of ways. And overload, underload is the major way we do that across all of our training because it's such an effective way. I think what I was going to say on the overload concept, because this has come up a lot actually from hitting, and so I think you could get into this for the weights, is that it's not to say there aren't inherent benefits from swinging a bat that is heavier at the same speed as your regular bat. There are inherent benefits to like a strength training concept there, for sure. So there is a little bit of that. But that is not the main and only reason that we swing heavy bats. So this is not the concept of pick up as heavy of an implement as you can and keep progressing in the way that we would for strength and conditioning, and then just keep swinging that. And so there hits a threshold. And so we watch this with video on the hitting side where you have picked up too heavy of an implement. And now any sort of adaptation that we are talking about and going for, we're losing because you're just taking that bat and just clubbing the shit out of it and trying to figure out how to move it. And all of the mechanics we're going for have broken down. There's the translation to the actual swing becomes minimal because you're not able to swing that regularly. And so there are products on the market where when I put in training for remote, like heavy bat, they'll show me and I'm like, not that. That's too heavy. That's not going to correlate in the way that we're talking about. We're not trying to swing that heavy. So on the hitting side, and I was trying to think really quickly, and I think it's probably similar. I'm almost positive it's very similar, but maybe even slightly bit heavier on the plyo side. But on the hitting side, we're typically talking in the 10 to 20% heavier than your regular bat range. And then from an underload standpoint, what I was going to say when I think of this, the concept on the hitting side, and again, we'll bring this back to plyos in a second, but the reason underload is so difficult is not just, I don't know that there's very few hitting mechanics where I'm like, if I put an underload bat in her hands, like we're gonna hurt her. Like, there might be some where we wouldn't want to do that. The reason underload can be so tricky is that it's 99% of the time feeding the problem. And for most young athletes, they can't adjust to that. Like, it just creates like everything just goes insane. They don't know how to.
They don't have the brakes yet, is what I was going to say, is we're talking about underload and speeding up their movement, their swing, their pitch, whatever. Most young athletes, that's why we talk about trunk stability. They just don't have the deceleration ability yet, and that's where it becomes tricky.
Right. Yeah. And so it can have benefits, but when you're feeding the issue. So we've started actually using this more on the hitting side than we have in the past, because we've actually Driveline has like a youth bat that we've been able to use that can actually withstand. The problem with softball underload for bats is that it's pretty light. And so it's been hard to make because they break and there's some issues with them. But we have some solutions right now. We've been using it more, and it's been excellent because the speeding up of it, and then it's the same concept. Now I've created this adjustment that my body has to like bring it in, like how am I going to have success here? If my arms, very similar in hitting, if my arms start beating everything else and I can't hit the ball and the task is to hit the ball, like how do I start controlling and syncing that up? So it does create a really positive thing. And I think like flipping that, because we don't really, in hitting, and again, this is a different concept than like run and throw and underload as fast as you can and that concept, but on hitting, it's not really like, oh, we're going to hurt this person. It's just like, because they don't have the brakes, like, is this going to be a benefit, or is this kid literally never going to make an adjustment with what I'm giving her? And then overload is probably going to be a better way for her to make the adjustments that we want her to, because we're slowing her down from that standpoint. So that's how we think of it on the hitting side. So I think, Ashley, it would be helpful to kind of go through the weights we use, because I think a lot of calls I get, and we hit this less because people are getting more familiar with Plyos and they're feeling comfortable. They're seeing the way we use them, the success people are having, that it doesn't cause pain. We like never, very, very small percentages. And we kind of know the instances that we have to pull back a little bit for what we use, but people are less scared. But I think there are a lot of times people are like, I don't want to incorporate Plyos without knowing exactly how to do it, because I'm like so scared of hurting people. And it's not because they're Plyos, it's because of the weights concept, because this overload, underload. So maybe talk about the weights and how you think about the weights, how heavy, how under we go, just kind of piggyback off of the general guidelines that Laura gave.
Yeah. And I was thinking of like, when you were like, it's the application, you could take a heavy Plyo and do like an arm circle and tell them to go as fast as they can. And that would be really bad.
Yes.
Like, and you could be like, I throw Plyos, you know what I mean? So it's like, it's not just like, do I think Plyos are magic? Damn right I do. But also it's the application that is
right. That's with everything.
Right. That's essentially what we're trying to say. It's like, so that's what's really important. That's why obviously we built the Plyo module, is because everyone wanted this opportunity to learn more about how do I write my own Plyo programming? What are the concepts? Basically, it's not about getting it right, but it's about understanding the concepts enough that you don't get it wrong. That's what the Plyo module helps you do, right? Is to like make sure you're in the safe zone, you're promoting the right things, etc. One comment, Laura, you're right. I'm not bored. The idea, you're right. I had this visual early on in like S2 OGX world where I learned about the sort of like consequences, that's a negative, or basically what the overload versus underload helped promote was by just videoing. I would just obsess over video. I'd be like laying on the floor like a wedding photographer or something, trying to get the shot, and seeing when this is what happens with her trunk and her arm when she's at this weight versus this weight. Those are the very early days of starting to like understand these concepts. So that actually was a cool reminder. So that's not boring. Thanks for bringing that up.
It's not
anyway,
boring
the
at all.
weights, no, it's not at all. The weights for us, the heaviest is 1 pound. Right now, we really use that in the glove arm to really just give some feedback on where the glove arm is in space. As far as what we're throwing out of the throwing arm, we're capping at 12 ounce. So 12 ounce, 8 ounce, 7 ounce. So 7, usually a softball is like around 6.8. So it's super close to 7. And then 5 ounce, which is the underload. So a little bit of underload, a little bit of overload, and then more of like a heavier. I love the 12, and that's in addition. Our earliest sets didn't have 12. They went from 8 to 1 pound or 8 ounce to 16 ounce. And the reason for that is because we didn't know what the hell we were doing. We just mimicked, we just like ordered what else was out there. Like, I'm sure that's right. That's basically what we thought. And basically the 1 pound puts a tremendous amount of stretch on the arm because it's so heavy. If you can do that, fine. But a lot of pitchers can't. They don't have that length through the arm. Their arm slot actually is quite short, and it causes some discomfort. So we were seeing that early on. Like the 1 pound was asking for the arm to create more stretch than was available to it, and that's not a great spot. And so that's really one after the 12 ounce. So FYI to anybody out there who doesn't have like our newest set, you got to upgrade because the concepts evolve, and it's important not to just like stay with your set from 1995 because the concepts do evolve. So just FYI on that. So basically those are the weights. And we most of the time are sitting in the 12 and the 8s and then getting into the 7. Because the way I think about it is the 7 like is the softball. That's the underload. Basically, once you get to that, it feels like underload. And so you're now trying to tap into this. Okay, we're creating more stretch. We're creating more length through the overload concepts. Now, when you get to 7, the focus is not on the stretch and the length because that's what the overload was for. The focus is on emptying it on time. The forearm has to be really fast in how it unravels. So if you're going to create more stretch, we're trying to create more stretch, not only through body, through the different drills we might be doing, also through the arm, like upper arm, through the chest, through the shoulder. That's where we're trying to recruit more stretch. And then if and when we can do that, then we want the lower arm to release that stretch. So what happens a lot of times for pitchers, and we use our arm data that we collect from a biomechanics standpoint to help feed exactly what protocol to give them, how much overload, how much underload, et cetera. A lot of times pitchers only achieve that stretch in the low arm. These are our forearm pain, elbow pain pitchers. They're really not getting a ton of stretch from the body. They're not getting a ton of stretch from the shoulder. So that forearm just like cranks into supination to hold it. They might have great ball flight. They probably have good spin rates, but it's at the expense of that forearm. So we're trying to create more stretch further up the chain for that, right? So it might be really, their protocols are really overload based. But because stiffness is a major issue in pitching, I actually find myself leaning more toward underload, not just the normal 7, but 5 ounces, way more than I used to. And what you are describing, Laura, is still absolutely accurate. Any pitcher that we are creating a plyo protocol that's centered around underload, it's all about speeding up, it's all about velo gain. Those are rare because the level of trunk stability, what we're going for is really a unique case. But what we often do a lot is when we get data that's the arm data is really just, we're not creating stretch anywhere. The upper arm is empty. It doesn't insufficient in stretch. The lower arm, meaning the forearm, is insufficient in stretch. Then we write these protocols that are about the combination. The majority of their plyo protocol is centered around overload. It's centered around creating stretch. And then the end really test them and ask them to like now get rid of some of that. They don't know how. If you don't have stretch, you don't know how to unravel. Does that make sense? Like there's nothing to unravel. It's just a push. So the overwhelming majority, probably 80% of the protocol is really about promoting the development of some stretch through the arm. And then at the end, we just test and we have to start training them to understand the emptying, the basically going from some sense of supination in that forearm to pronation, to be able to turn, to be able to be fast through it. And so I would say a good chunk of our athletes tap into that concept. Anyone that's showing that they have stretch through the lower arm only and not the upper arm, we stay away from that because they're already doing all of it in the lower arm. And the data tells us what's appropriate. It's why we're able to get data. We see what's going on at the arm. We see how much is the body contributing to stretch, how much is the upper arm contributing to stretch, how much is the lower arm contributing to stretch. And then boom, here's the plyo protocol based on what do they get with overload, what do they get with underload. Obviously, how do we get the body to do more as part of that as well, but that's not related to the weights that we're referring to. But that's the center of the concept. We're trying to recruit more from the places that aren't giving enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's just so interesting. It's like hard because we're so far removed from it at this point. It's hard to, when people are like, heavy balls will hurt people. And the way we use them, that just like, that phrase doesn't even make sense. So it's just like hard to even
I'm like, wrap our brains. I didn't know I went into a time capsule.
Our brains
went back to
like
1974.
Confused about them. Like, yeah, of course, if you use them in a way that doesn't make sense. And as you said, I'm sure there are protocols people are still using that we wouldn't. But in the way we use them, we see that opposite quite a bit, where people who are in pain come out of pain from doing this. Like, so it's,
Crystal, when someone comes to us that like with some generic, here's my doctor gave me this article from wherever about weighted balls and arm pain, and it's offensive. I find it offensive because I'm like, this is not remotely what we do with Plyos. This is not even, we're not remotely speaking the same language. And the thought that goes into how we design Plyos, it is such a lack of recognition of the thought behind the concepts for us that I'm like, nope, we cannot. Thank you for bringing me that article, because now I know we are not remotely speaking the same language, so it doesn't really matter what I say. But then, that's kind of how I feel.
That same, let's pick on the doctors for a second. That same doctor would be like, but you can do dry arm circles. And what I want to say is that's underload. Hang on a second. That's underload.
For sure.
Right? If you're talking about just like, you can just throw your arm, no problem. You are taking the 7 ounces away that she was holding. So that's underload to her body. And when you said, like, I find that offensive, like that hit me right in my soul, like, because there is so much thought around it.
I do. I really do. It is.
Like, one of the things I think is just so incredible about the thoughtfulness of I'll use our return to pitching. It's the one I deal with the most, is that it is about changing one variable at a time. I think that is the most genius thing besides just the application of Plyos that goes into that protocol. Because as we talk about, again, whether it's overhand throwing, hitting, it doesn't really matter. You've got to know where that athlete, if they are returning from injury, if they are managing pain or soreness, what is the variable that trips them up? Is it volume? Is it intensity? Is it a particular weight? Is it a lack of the ability to manage the variability that Plyos are providing? And so the thoughtfulness of like, all right, we're going to go one variable at a time here, right? Maybe we change trunk intensity at this point in this week. Maybe the next day, then we're talking about adding volume to that intensity. And so then when someone has soreness, we have, standard soreness rules. It's really easy to go back to and say, okay, it was a volume concept, or all right, that maybe that weight wasn't appropriate for you, or some aspect of that. It becomes so clear of like, what stress did they get tripped up by, essentially. And I think that was it's one of the most incredible pieces of that protocol is how thoughtful that is.
Yeah. Well, and it's also the way I think it's so important for people that, like, if someone has pain from a variable that you've introduced, a weight or whatever, you're not talking about what you're putting on them as like, if you pick the wrong weight and you throw one, this kid's going to tear her labrum. Like that, it happens. So, it's such a combination of factors. And so if you generally know what that person's body, general concepts about the body. So to flip back to the hitting side, things that I would be careful about giving underload. It's not, like I said, there's not many on the hitting side. It is different. We see less breakdowns, I think, cause things that dramatically, I guess. And there's way less volume overall that a hitter goes under. But rotation through the lower back, we see it sometimes the way they decelerate is through a lot of extension through their lower back, and the way sometimes we see deceleration through the knee, through the front knee. Those two things are the ones that we sometimes flag for workload. And in those cases, I would give overload to those athletes, but I would be careful about underload because it's a deceleration concept, as you said. And it's not like, because tomorrow, if I hand an underload bat and that kid, she's going to tear her ACL, probably not, but she's probably going to feel some breakdowns that aren't going to be great. And we need to fix that pattern before we feed it in that way. Like, we're just that's not the way we're going to go after it. And so it's these concepts of, what does underload do, right? What does underload do? Why are you doing underload? What does overload do? Don't just randomly grab overload, underload. It's why the Plyo program, kind of pointing people to that. I think people don't always know we have that from the pitching side, but what it goes through is the pitching movement, why we use Plyos the way we do, these concepts of overload. So there's some basic understanding of like, why are we even doing the things we do, which I think is important. Because it isn't the same to just pick up a 42-ounce bat and swing it. Like, that is not the same concept of what we are doing with overload on the hitting side, or picking up a 3-pound Plyo and running and throwing it is not what we're talking about here. That's not how we incorporate that. So I think having this general background understanding, having a general you don't need to necessarily, obviously we're able to be more individualize and systemize in our protocols because we do have so much data. So like, that's great. If you can get biomechanics data on your pitchers, hitters, that's great. You don't necessarily need to know all of those details. If you can generally look at some of the things that we put out or others have put out about the biomechanics and what we typically see and understand.
No, you just need the Plyo module.
General, right. Understand the body and these general concepts, and then just monitor, and if that athlete is like, this feels a little uncomfortable, like why? It's the same thing when Ashley, we do have athletes that still throw the 1 pound and they're fine. We know when not to hand those. This isn't like we use that 1 pound and then 4 kids just ripped their arm off. It's just like they felt a little uncomfortable. It was not putting the right things that we wanted to put. It was a little too heavy for, an amount, and this 12 ounce hit more of the sweet spot for what we were going for. And we saw that through time, and it was just this gradual thing. It wasn't this big scary moment of something that we incorporated. So I think it's not,
don't be afraid, essentially.
Don't be afraid if you take it from that approach. If you're gonna you don't have that background and you're just like, I'm going to pick up the heaviest thing I can, I'm going to chuck it, and this is going to get, maybe be afraid. Like, that's not what we're going for. In the same way,
be afraid of yourself.
Yeah. In the same way that we talked about all the way on the return to pitch thing, if your doctor's like, here's an overhand, throwing program, maybe be a little afraid, because that's like, what am I doing here? So like, if you don't have the background concepts, that's not great because it is in the application, but the overarching, like that just, it's so foreign for us because we have seen a reduction in pain for most people that use these concepts. We have seen a promotion of great mechanics. Like, we just don't come across that. And when we do, we're able to solve it usually. Like, we know why it's happening.
Well, we're talking about risk reward here. Risk is so small. It's like minimal, if anything, for the majority of our athletes, and reward as just, I mean, this is like literally seesaw like this in risk reward for Plyo.
Right.
So just like it just
Well, we have we have people that we, some colleges we work with who have had athletes with pain, and then they're like, we just couldn't get it out of it. And not everyone, people work with us in different capacities, so it's not like every single person that's ever worked with us has their pitchers going through Plyo programs, so they just haven't incorporated that yet. And so I'll always be like, oh, how did she feel with Plyos? Like, oh, we didn't get to that. And I'm like,
that's
like
step one. Yeah.
Because we just have seen, the comment we made about the pitcher who was
like,
the
lowest hanging fruit. It is the lowest hanging fruit.
It was Plyos, but I think it's just such an important concept. So anyways, let's stop there. We could go on these concepts forever. I will point you, just because I feel like not everyone knows, we have the Plyo module. Like I said, it has the background of the pitching motion. This is specific to pitching, underhand pitching for softball, but it has the pitching motion, why we use Plyos, all the variables we manipulate for Plyos. So weight, start types, intensity, all the things that we do there.
Full education.
Yeah. And then the very bottom, which is what the people actually want, you get to a place where you're like, I'm going to watch a video of my own pictures. I select some things and you get a program after it out of it. So it's definitely worth it. It's not that expensive. You get it forever. Like, if we make updates to it, you'll get them because we can make it on the online system. So I think it's worth getting, and not everyone knows we have it. But this is the basic concept of it. All pitchers need to be doing it. Overload, underload concept is what you should be doing in all of your training. But these are things that everyone should be doing. So we're going to go. But until next week.